So if you look at the costs and owner shares through the three major phases, decommissioning being on the back end, 27, 22, and 50%. And when you read this chart, what you're missing is, what they're charting is the avoidance costs. The owner bears 50% of the burden for the avoidance costs after he's moved into the building. So from the minute he signs you to do design work for him or signs the constructor to build it, he's assuming a certain amount of costs he's going to live with on the back end. If you look at it another way, that's the 2/3 of the cost that the owner bears through the life cycle of his facility for the inefficiencies we have in our industry. This is why this is an important conversation. This is why all of the large campus-based owners that I've had the pleasure to work with for the last 2 years are really starting to unfocus around design and construction and focus on life cycle. 3 years ago, we didn't know how we were going to build all of the new buildings. Then we had an economic collapse. Now everybody wants to know how we're going to make the existing buildings more efficient and manage them more efficiently. That's the conversation people are having. That is a huge opportunity for A&Es. And one firm that's made that venture in here is going to give you some insight tonight on what they've done. So now, let me quantify the opportunity for you in another way. Take that same chart, understand that above the line are one-time costs, understand that below the line are costs. An owner right now is paying 23 cents per square foot per year to deal with the inefficiencies through design and construction. I asked the Associate VP of Facilities for a university with 10 million square feet. I said, Pete, this is $2.3 million at your university every year. Is that number believable? He said that number's low. I asked another Associate VP at a Western university with 34 million square feet. I said, that's almost 10 million a year to you. Is that number believable? He said, if you could cut in half the number of Cushman trips, you know those little carts they run around on campuses? If you could cut in half the number of Cushman trips, you've saved me over $2 million a year. Huge quantifiable numbers when you start to talk to owners. So think about that from a perspective. So how does BIM apply in all this? So that's the story. That's what you should be thinking about as an opportunity to help these owners understand this. What's the application of BIM? Well, we've all talked about this idea of what BIM is, and I really like to unwrap people's head from the idea that BIM is 3D. BIM is about the eye, right? It's really about this idea of computable information. And I love to give a very specific facilities-oriented slant to this and help you understand this. Let's take a floor plan, for instance, okay? In a building information modeling environment, I should be able to ask a question of my model and it should be able to answer it. That's computable building information, right? So I should be able to tell a floor plan where are the room numbers, and it should be able to color itself or highlight itself. Where are the room names? These are very important information from a facility standpoint. Where are the floor finishes? Where do I have floor finishes of which type in which areas of a building? A lot of applications for that. Let me tell you one you probably haven't thought about. If I'm moving a department from one area to another, and I have carpet tile on the floor, and I don't put plywood down over that carpet tile, by the time they get done rolling carts over that carpet tile's too big to fit, and it all buckles. And they pay somebody to come in and trim 1/8 of an inch off every one of those tiles to put them back down because you stretch the tiles rolling parts up. That's how owners think about buildings. Those are the things they deal with. If you can provide them through a building information model, the tools to find out where their floor finishes are, their move planning people now can work around that constraint. And then last but not least, how many square feet are each of those areas? So I can start to calculate maintenance costs based on floor finish. Very simple stuff. Doesn't require an elaborate three-dimensional model. Requires a certain amount of information to answer the questions. And that's the important point. The questions should be answered by the information in the model, and they should complement each other. We don't need elaborate models if these are all of the questions we're going to ask. So it comes down to use cases, and we'll talk very specifically about that in a little bit. So the first thing that benefits an owner is the idea of bidirectional data exchange. One of the big things about BIM is everything stays coordinated, right? Think about the benefit to an owner if the docs he has for a reference are truly coordinated. Because guess what happens? When you do an RFI, because a detail bubble doesn't line up or doesn't coordinate with the correct detail, that information never gets it back to the set the owner has. Almost never. He doesn't even have current information from that standpoint, so they're trying to figure out details. But the biggest point is the support for lifecycle data that exists in that BIM model through initiatives like COBE. I mean, I am a huge COBE fan, and I compliment Bill East because he was the first guy who threw something out there and went, here. Admitted it probably wasn't the end solution, but somebody threw something out there. And if you're not familiar with COBE, it's the Construction Operations Building Information Exchange. Please go look up COBE on the Building Smart website, or actually the whole Building Design Guide website. I've got some links to some of these later I'll give you. So great initiative to understand this idea of data. I want to put it to you in another way by helping you understand the difference between BIM and CAD and why this makes sense to an owner. Okay? CAD started as a purely documentation task. I always like to tell people, I graduated college in '85. If we were honest enough, we would admit to ourselves that CAD happened to us in the '80s. Can we think of a single day when we started and made the decision to use CAD? You know, I can remember taking my CAD drawings and plotting them out and having ammonia mylars run them so the engineers could draw by hand over the top of them. And the reason why that could happen was it was merely a medium in which we produced a deliverable. We changed the medium in which we produce a deliverable. We went from ink on mylar to plastic lead on vellum to electrons on a computer screen, which interestingly enough we sent to a pen plotter, which took us back to ink on mylar. So we just completed the circle, but it was just a medium. Then we got into object CAD. Things started to change. Now we started to have our CAD models that could compute some things for us, okay? And we moved a little further towards the conceptual side of design. Now we started to have to work on the same platforms, and we started to have to share data. But the point was we were still engaging the technology way too late in the process. And one of the things everybody in this room has understood when they made the transition to BIM is you have to start in BIM in order to finish in BIM. It becomes a process all the way through. Why is that important to an owner? Because in the beginning of the process, before typical CAD technologies are involved, is when you start gathering the data he needs to manage that building. If he could give you a naming convention, engineers in the room, if he could give you a naming convention for his HVAC equipment and say, here's how you number my air handlers, here's how you number my VAV boxes, they can automatically link to his management systems later. All he has to do is give you simple information. All you have to do is add a single parameter to the BIM model, right? A single parameter. That's all it takes. It can be that simple. This is why you can have value conversations with an owner you haven't been able to have yet. Naming conventions. I can promise you a university anguishes over their room number and naming conventions because they have legal connotations in how that space is charged back. If you do government grants, it's a huge issue for you and how you name a number of space based on your ability to track it against that grant. They struggle with this. You're creating the floor plans, you're creating the rooms and initially naming and numbering them. I see opportunity. So let me put this to you another way. I think this is when it really made sense to me. We've all seen HOK's McLeamy graph many, many times. And the point Patrick McLeamy was trying to make was we want to be spending our time in the front of the process where we can affect change, right? Let me overlay the graph I just went through. Now does it make sense? Now we're spending our time up front where you have not only the ability to most cost-effectively affect change on the design, but you have the ability to start to gather and develop the life cycle data that owner needs to manage his facility over his life cycle. This is when it clicked for me when I started to have these conversations. This is why we should be spending our time up front on a BIM model. This is why we should be putting information in, because now we're truly benefiting the owner and helping him understand exactly what that was. So